Compañero, welcome. My name is Carlos El Chacon, and my podcast aims to bring you together with others working with SQL Server and engage in conversations to share ideas, meet old friends, and make a few new friends along the way. I call it the SQL Trail. Thanks for joining me.
SQL Data Partners.
Compañeros, welcome back to the SQL Trail. This is episode 129 of the SQL Data Partners podcast. Our guest today is AZ. He is here locally in Richmond. He was our guest in episode 61, I believe, with talking about USQL. And so he's back, and today we're going to be talking about graph databases, giving it an introduction or an overview to them and how we might be able to take advantage of that in SQL Server 2017. Before we get into that, we do have a couple of compañero shout-outs. The first to Grant Fritchie. We are actually planning or having our SQL Saturday this weekend, and we were lucky enough to have Grant come down to our user group and talk with us last night. And then he, Andy, Kelly, and I went out afterwards and then chatted for a good bit. And it's always nice to catch up with him, see what he's doing. Shout out to David Stokes, who came up for the pre-con and from Hampton. And of course, David is a regular compañero listener, so always good to spend time with David. Want to give shout outs to Brian Hundley for connecting with us on Twitter, David Zhang and Jason Lamb for connecting with us on LinkedIn. Hope you all are doing well, and it's nice to catch up with you. Today, we do have a tip and trick that I want to pass along from listener Douglas Kemp. And so Douglas has actually been able to play with some new features that I admit I have been wanting to get my hands on. It's just been on my to-do list, but I haven't been able to do. He actually has used the rolling upgrade feature. So now with Windows clustering, you can go from a 2012 to a 2016 if you're using Windows Server 2016. Whereas before you had to have the same OS version. Now, from an upgrade perspective, you can connect with a different Windows OS and upgrade that SQL Server. So that's what he had done. He installed Windows 2016 with SQL Server 2016 and was looking to do the rolling upgrade. So moved everything over, failed it over. That worked fine. Then he went back, refreshed what is now the secondary server, got that all ready, popped it back in. But what he said that it showed that it was synchronizing and recovering, which he thought was strange, right? So normally we're used to seeing synchronizing because we have the two nodes, and obviously the data is moving back and forth between the two of them. But he was confused by the restoring. And so it wasn't until he failed back over to that secondary node that the new version settings were applied, and that ultimately the entire cluster was now at 2016. So it seems like there's a check in there that says, hey, I need to make sure that all my nodes are at 2016 before I will upgrade. And so once he did that, the restoring status disappeared and his cluster was happy and available. So thanks, Douglas, for that tip. For those of you who are thinking about doing those upgrades, that might come in handy for you as to why you're seeing that in the future. And that, compañeros, is today's tip and trick. We are also still working out our speakers. However, I can confirm the dates for SQL Trail 2018. It will be October 10th through the 12th. It will be here in Richmond. As I mentioned, we are still working out some of the speakers. We have a great venue downtown, which I think is going to provide lots of flexibility for us, which is one of the things that we're looking for. We are probably going to open registration in late April, so we're still a little ways off from doing that, or the 1st of May. We're still putting together the website, transitioning to the new SQLtrail.com. But that's exciting. We're excited to continue to put this together, and we think we're going to have another great conference. Okay, so as we mentioned, today's episode is on SQL Graph. So one of the interesting things about SQL Graph is a new feature, SQL Server 2017 only. And so today our conversation is going to revolve around what is it, how we might start using it. And AZ has some interesting thoughts on that. And in addition to what the future might hold, because obviously this is a version 1 feature. And so our show notes for today's episode, AZ has a couple of images. I'm not sure he's doing videos, but he has a couple of things on his blog, and we will post that up on the show notes for today's episode is SQLDataPartners.com/graph or SQLDataPartners.com/129. And with that, let's go ahead and jump into the conversation with AZ. AZ, it's great to have you back on the program. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here, Carlos.
Yeah, so just going back over the calendar, you were with us in episode 60 talking about USQL. And so today we're going to be switching gears a little bit and be talking about the graph database. But thanks for coming back on and chatting with us.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
In preparation for this episode, I go into Books Online and it says, now this comes from the Microsoft documentation, mind you, right? So that's where I'm reading this. There is nothing a graph database can achieve which cannot be achieved using a relational database.
That's right. At least with this iteration, yes.
So then tell me, why has graph technology been implemented into the database?
There are lots of other graph databases that have lots of other features, but right now we are in the first version of this in SQL Server. It kind of makes some of those queries easier, but it's nothing that you can do using graph database that you cannot already do using the relational.
Right.
But when you have to write some queries, it's much easier actually with the way how the syntax has been restructured. It's easy to follow through actually.
So yeah, that is the point, the ability or the ease of which you can pull relationships or demonstrate relationships, right?
That's right.
So we think about social networking, fraud detection, IT network analysis, transportation network, social product or content recommendations.
Yes.
So these strongly defined relationships over multiple points, you might call them many-to-many relationships.
Yeah, they really shine there, yes.
That's right. So that is kind of the purpose or the goal of the graph database, right?
That's right.
And they've introduced that. Now, again, we can do recursion in SQL Server, and it is possible, but it reminds me, I remember sitting in Lewis Davidson's session talking a little bit about hierarchy. He had like a 500 node example, and then he's like, oh, okay, and then we're going to change number 247.
Mm-hmm.
And the amount of work and effort that was involved to make all those changes, I thought, okay, well, this is a feature I'll never implement. Because it was so cumbersome, right? It was so difficult to put together. And so I think now that we have graph database, in theory, it will be easier to put that together. Now, I think this is where we get into it is a different model. I think that's the right word for it. So
yeah.
We're used to the relational model. We have two tables and they're related by a foreign key. Now, that foreign key is an object in the database.
Mm-hmm.
We don't see it. We can't look at the data and tell that there's a relationship there.
Yeah, the relationships are maintained in a separate table. They're called the edges, the edge table that kind of shows the relationship between the nodes. So we have a separate table.
Right.
All it does is show the relationships.
Yeah, so that's on the graph side.
Right.
So now there are these two types, nodes and edges.
That's right.
Nodes are the objects, if you will, that we're talking about.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And because I saw your presentation, we'll extend the example that you had there. And this is, so people that I know and authors of books.
That's right.
Or even books. So that example. And then you can have multiple relationships regarding that.
That's right.
And so the node is the person.
Uh-huh.
And then the edge, as you just described it, right, is that relationship.
That's right.
What I think is interesting is that, like we talked about, you can't look at the data in a relational table, just looking at the data itself and know that there's a relationship. But as you mentioned, I go to the edge and I'm actually saying, hey, this node ID of 1 corresponds to or has a relationship with node ID of 10 or whatever.
Uh-huh.
And I can see that.
Yes.
I think it makes it easier to understand or to form ideas about what's going on with the data.
That's right. And at least with this iteration, the very first iteration of the SQL graph and SQL Server doesn't have a UI, meaning like a graphical UI.
Right.
So you can intuitively look at data and then detect any relationship. You have other competitors actually like Neo4j and other databases. Just looking at it, you can try to detect some relationship between different entities and the relationships. But here, right now, we can use Power BI. Nothing is there that's available out of the box, actually, with SSMS. Probably that may be coming in subsequent versions, but not as of now.
Yeah, and that is one of the challenges, I think, or the hops that I needed to get, as I was looking at this after I saw your presentation, and you tend to think of the graph as the image. So there's a circle and then there's a line to another circle.
That's right.
And then you look at it in SQL Server and you're like, well, wait a second. That doesn't look like as I was expecting. And so, I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But it is, you have to look at the data, and that's really all you have in this first version of SQL Server.
That's right.
Obviously, we don't know, but if you were to look down at the next iteration, where do you think that tooling is going to go?
I would expect at least like some kind of dynamic relationships. With Neo4j, if you want to have a new relationship between a node, all you have to do is just create it on the fly because it's a pure NoSQL database. But here they kind of implemented this as part of or an extension of the relational database.
Right.
So you have to create a new H table to have any kind of new relationship. You cannot just on the fly create a relationship. You have to create an H table, and then you have to create either it's going to be one way or two way. You have to make some entries in the H table between two nodes. So it's not as dynamic as we want it to be. I would expect in subsequent versions, we might get those features in.
Interesting. Okay. That's an interesting or an important piece to remember is that, you are creating it's basically the same old table that we've had.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remind me on the nodes, I think it's all the same, but the edges is where we get the JSON data.
No, it's JSON is the way how they represent IDs so that we can use it in our application.
Oh, gotcha.
But internally, they are stored as int or big ints or something like that. But when they expose it as nvarchar of 1000, and you get the JSON string actually. That JSON has what type of node or what type of object it is. It's a node or an edge. And then you have the schema, the table, and then the IDs.
Okay. So yes, we're not going to see the foreign key relationship, as we mentioned. The data is just going to tell us how the matches are there. But there are some different ways in which we're going to be able to see or interact with this inside of SQL Server.
That's right.
So in sys.tables, there's a couple of changes there.
That's right. So we have like two additional
columns.
You have like lots of hidden columns actually that are not accessible that SQL Server uses to maintain those behind the scenes.
Oh, gotcha. We get to see two, but there's many more behind the scenes.
Yeah, a lot more actually behind the scenes.
Okay. And then in SSMS, how are we interacting with these tables?
Just like regular queries, you can just make some calls. Like you just do a select star from whatever the table name is, a node or an edge. But if you want to look at the relationship, they've introduced a match predicate. So you can use this predicate instead of, usually what we see is like in relational database, the more number of tables you do joins, the slower the query becomes.
Right.
They're trying to improvise on that actually. So then instead of that, in a typical graph database, the more number of tables you join, it should be linear instead of exponential. In SQL Server, the more number of tables you join, it's going to slow down exponentially. That is the reason in a data warehouse, they kind of denormalize. But whereas in a graph database, technically it should be linear rather than exponential. So you should see no slowing down if the number of tables increases. So that's kind of one of the goals of a graph database.
Interesting. So regardless of the number of nodes?
That's right. Number of joins.
Or the number of joins. Okay.
That's right.
So you brought up the match predicate. And so that is how we define those relationships, right? So instead of inner join table one on, and this show the relationship, we're going to use that matches predicate.
That's right. And they gotten rid of all the join keyword at all, actually. So earlier, Microsoft was saying, actually, you select certain columns from table one, inner join table two on whatever the conditions are. Now, that's what they were recommending. Now, we're kind of going one step back. We'll say, like, select columns from table one, comma, table two, where match whatever the conditions you have, the predicates in them. So it's kind of like we're going back to table one, comma, table two, comma, table three kind of thing. They were kind of discouraging us.
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay.
We're back to that. So hopefully we'll go back to the earlier one, actually. They want to avoid the join keyword there. So I think that's kind of the premise, actually, what they headed in this direction.
You think that's just more to avoid confusion, to help identify, hey, this is a graph table, this is a relational table? Or do you think there's some other reason behind that?
I think they just want to get rid of the joins because the match is going to take care of the equivalent join statements.
Right.
They're going to get rid of the join, but then all the while they were kind of corralling us to go down that road. Now they're asking us to step back. So hopefully they come back with something that's consistent that we can use it for graph as well as for relational.
Okay. So one additional item I did see in SSMS is that those graph tables are now stored in a folder.
Yeah.
So very similar to the system tables that we might in the newer versions of SSMS.
Yeah, that's just the GUI actually in SSMS. But if you look in SQL Operations Studio, you won't see that separate folder actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so just SSMS provides you that option. I think it all based on the type of table it is. I think based on that, it kind of groups them into different folders. Just kind of a view, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah, just organizational thing. Yeah.
Right. Now, so again, going back to this challenge of the visualization, we've gotten used to the joins. And then, of course, with graph, they're showing us the circles and the lines together. How have you managed to begin the process of understanding those relationships or thinking about them in a different way beyond the traditional relational model?
Yeah, I would start with an inner join thing, inner join or left join or something like that, and then try to model that and try to come up with what is equivalent using the match predicate, and then try to go from there actually. So it's kind of equivalent to that, but then like it's much simplified. So if you have 10 joins and the conditions are like probably 10 conditions or something like that, you can write it in a couple of matches. So it kind of simplifies whatever that comes after the where clause. Instead of having like multiple things like where this condition is equal to this table 1 dot column is equal to table 2 dot whatever column, things like that. Kind of you create an alias in the from clause and then you refer to that in the match predicate. And they use something called chart or ASCII art, where like everything is represented using just alphabets or the alias names within parentheses and the arrows.
Right. Yes, that syntax is a little different, right, as well.
Yeah, a little bit different actually. And I've used Neo4j. Neo4j, the entities or the nodes are represented within circular parentheses. And then you just represent the arrows going toward whether it's a left bound or right bound. And then you have the relationship and then you have the other node. In SQL Server, it's kind of a little bit different. So you don't encapsulate our nodes within any parenthesis, anything like that. Nodes, you just have just the alias. And then you have the directional thing. And then the edges, they have parentheses. So nodes dash within parentheses, whatever the edges are you're referring to, and then like another dash, and the arrows depending on whether you go from left to right or right to left, and then another node.
Right. So that's the nomenclature. Those arrows indicate the direction of the relationship there.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. Because that will take some getting used to, and we'll have to have some test queries before we before we get that there.
Yep.
Huh. So I guess other thoughts on getting started. Or we talked about hierarchies, and I think in the traditional business sense, employee manager is probably the typical choice. Under what other circumstances or what other examples maybe would you find people wanting to pick up the graph database?
One of the limitations with the hierarchy is actually you can have a single child can only look up to one parent. You can have multiple parents, but with the graph database, you can have multiple parents for a child.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, so that's one of the things. And again, like we can use it for the recommendation systems and things like that. This person actually who bought this book also purchased the other book, whatever you see from Amazon.com or the LinkedIn, actually, okay, this person knows it, probably like, there's a chance that you might also know him, or probably you might want to extend an invitation to him, things like that. So these are some of the use cases actually for the graph database. Almost all the big companies, they have some implementation of graph database. So this is Microsoft SQL servers actually. They already have in the Cosmos DB, but for people who are already used to using SQL Server, they don't want those people to go and use a different database. So this is just an attempt for them to give those features within the SQL Server. So they made it an extension of the engine actually. So it comes with the engine. There is no way for you to, during installation, to not install this component. It comes with the engine. So whether even in a Docker or something, once you install it, it comes with the engine.
Yeah, that's an important point, right? I don't have to do anything differently to get this feature. It is baked in.
That's right. They call it SQL Graph Extension. So, yeah.
Okay, interesting. When you talk about using graph and tools that can consume it, we already talked about Power BI. Does that mean that Power BI is the only quote unquote current tool that has the extensions to be able to read those relationships? Or, I mean, I feel like if it's JSON data, I could display that and then even have reporting services read that.
Yes, it's a JSON data. If you have, you can develop your own custom control and you can display it the way how you want it. Microsoft with the Power BI, they already have a graph type called like Force Graph that's developed by Microsoft. That's available in the gallery. So you just pull that into Power BI and that kind of out of the box provides you that experience actually where you can see the nodes, edges and nodes and those kind of stuff. But it's just JSON data. So if you have some .NET control, UI control that can display that, yeah, you're more than welcome to use that. So
okay.
But there is nothing out of the box within SSMS that you can look at it.
Gotcha. Well, other than selecting from it, and then you'd have to figure out how you're going to display it. I mean, because the query will return results, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Only thing is, we had to go outside of that environment to visualize it. That is kind of the shortcoming with the current version.
Right. Okay.
And if you're using SQL Operations Studio, you have the option to create your own widgets. So probably if you have some graphing capability or like you've come up with your own way of putting together things, you can create your own widget. You can display it part of the SQL Operations Studio.
Okay. Yes, that will be something you have to show me afterwards, because I did try actually playing with those widgets and I could not figure out how to create my own.
Yeah, some of those things that's available there in the gallery, but you have the option to extend it yourself. So probably I can show you to you afterwards.
I guess was not even familiar with the Operations Studio gallery. There's a gallery for the Operations Studio, huh?
Yeah.
Interesting.
So with the Insight, like it's something that's available right out of the box that you can use it, but there's an option to extend it. So if you know some B3JS or some programming, you can create your own widget and then you should be able to incorporate them.
Okay. So obviously you talked about displaying it. So if I'm going to start developing with Graph Database, I have to have a way to consume that data and then display it. Other thoughts that developers might need to know when they start working with it?
One thing is you don't have to know. All you need is the graphing engine could be used only for the joins. Sometimes if you have existing data in the regular SQL tables, you can use that table also in the query. Only thing is they cannot be used in the match predicate, the regular SQL Server tables, but the rest of the data can still be there. Assume you have lots of image data or the other kind of data like varchar and things like that. You don't have to bring everything into the graph tables. Those things can remain there. All you need to do is just bring in the keys so that for querying and things like that, you could use the graph DB portion of it and still refer back to the SQL Server tables for the data part of it.
Okay, yes, that's an important point. You don't necessarily have to push everything to the graph database.
That's right. You can mix and match.
Okay. Yeah, that will be fun. So from the execution plan, if I look at that, am I doing another remote procedure call as well? Or do I actually get to get some data on what it's doing there with the nodes?
I think with the SQL, with the plan, you should be able to see what it's doing behind the scenes. Actually, they all kind of translate to the regular joins behind the scenes. The engine does that for us. So you should be able to look at the plan and see how the compiler does those things, and you should be able to see that.
Okay. So the graph database takes advantage of the JSON feature, which they introduced in 2017. Do you think that there are going to be other features that they introduce that are going to take advantage of the graph functionalities?
I wouldn't say they're taking advantage of the JSON functionality. They're exposing the keys in JSON format. So
okay. It would have to have JSON support, don't you think, in order for them to show that in JSON format, or no?
No, the way how SQL Server implemented is they don't have a JSON data type per se. All they have is through the varchar. So they did playing it in that format so that the application can consume it, because we have lots of other libraries that can easily, given a JSON string, it can access that through different hierarchies. So we already have the object model on the development side. So they expose it as such. So it's easy for us to consume it. I don't think they're maintaining it in JSON.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay. Well, awesome. Well, thanks for giving us that overview there. Other final thoughts about Graph Database?
Yes, there are lots of internal features that are not exposed. They mention actually all those hidden fields and those things, they kind of computed columns. But when you query the sys.computed columns, you won't find an entry there. So certain things actually, they kind of very internal. You don't have access to some of those things. You can query some of those hidden columns. So hopefully in the future versions, they give us access, or when you want to insert data into the edges table, you have to query both the nodes and get the ID and then insert it. So hopefully there's a better way for us to enter data into the relation table. There are lots of things that need to be improved before we can use it mainstream.
Okay. Yeah. Sometimes that makes me wonder, right? Why do we need to see those columns? But I guess there could be some information that would be useful to us. Yeah, so we'll have to see what future iterations hold for us there.
That's right. And again, I'm looking at lots of other graph databases that's available on the market, and the leading ones are the Neo4j and the Cosmos DB. But Cosmos is it's a multi-model database, so you have other data types like a key value pair, of column family and things like that. So out of which graph database is one of them, and that's a NoSQL data type. And the one that's available in the SQL Server is a relational implementation of the graph database.
Okay.
So it has its own limitations as to what you can do with that. And with the Neo4j, you can have, it's got lots of other functions. So it's a matured graph product. Like you can do polymorphic queries, transitive closure, like a variable number of hops. Like you don't care about how many nodes and relations are there between two nodes. It can do multiple hops and try to find some matches and things like that. So those are not available with the graph database yet. And there are lots of built-in functions like a shortest path function and things like that's available in Neo4j. Like assume like you go from one place to another. Take, for example, Google Maps and things like that. From one place to another, like either you want to go through the fastest route or a scenic route and things like that. You have different logic. So you want to find the shortest path. There are functions that does it, but here you have to write your own store procedure or something like that, and you have to implement it on your own. Those things are not available out of the box.
Gotcha. Right. So there are some helpers, if you will, that aren't quite available just yet.
That's right.
It'll be interesting to see what happens on the horizon there.
Yep.
Awesome. So should we go ahead and do SQL Family?
Sure. Yep.
Now, how did you first get started with SQL Server?
Oh, yeah, that was 22 years back in 95. That dates me. I was working on SQL version 4.2. That's when I got started. That's back like Windows NT 3.51 days. So I was doing my MCSE as I was pursuing that, and I needed to take a couple of database certifications. So I did SQL Server 4.2 administration and implementation. So that's how it got started, actually. I didn't want to be a database administrator or anything like that. I came from a novel background, actually. I was moving into the Microsoft Windows NT land. I was doing my Microsoft Certified Systems Engineer certification at that point in time. So out of 7 or 8 certifications that you need to do, 2 of them are database related. So that's my first foray into databases. I did a program using like DBase 3+ and Clipper, but not on like the full-fledged RDBMS thing. So.
Okay. In all that time working with SQL Server, there's been many changes, obviously. And we've just talked about one of the newest ones with the 2017 feature in the graph database. But if there's one thing that you could change in SQL Server, what would it be?
There is one thing. Yeah, there are lots of things that could be made better, but I like the way how things are headed. I'm playing a lot around like with the Dockers actually implementing or like just creating containers from SQL Server images for on the Windows container as well as on the Linux container.
Right.
So, but the images, there is not like a parity between those two environments. Like the image that I see on the Linux side, it's 1.8 GB or something for SQL Server. But if I have to create on the Windows side for the Express, it took 13.8 GB. And for the developer edition, it took 15 GB actually. So it's even in Docker, it's kind of like the download of the image takes a long time. I think maybe because like too many features are available on the Windows side, not everything is available on Linux side yet.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's pretty much just the engine, right? So all of the other things like SSIS or other things that just aren't unavailable, SSIS, all that stuff.
That's right.
It'll be interesting to see what happens there.
Yep. And they have .NET Core that's available ported to other platforms. So you could use some of them actually on the Linux Mac side. I like the way where things are headed. There are too many things that I would like to see change, but then like, I don't know if I can point just one actually. In Graph itself, there are lots of other places where things could be improved, like creation of relationships on the fly instead of creating a table and then like establishing it. And then some better way of inputting the relationships. Yeah, instead of querying the nodes and then like getting the IDs and then inserting it into the relationship table. So those would be a couple of things that they could improve.
Yeah, you want to look forward to. Okay, very cool. What's the best piece of career advice you've received?
Yeah, we received a lot of advice from a lot of people. If I have to remember one thing, actually, like I like the quote from Martin Luther King, actually. Doesn't matter what you are, actually be the best at it. Like if a man is called to be a street sweeper or something, yeah, he might as well be the best sweeper or something like that. So whatever you take, like just be the best in that.
There you go. I like that. In a world where social media, we're always comparing ourselves to other people. What an interesting change it would be just to think about what it is that we're doing and be the very best at that.
Yep. Yes.
AZ, our last question for you today. If you could have one superhero power, what would it be and why do you want it?
Yeah, I think like I would go with the same thing that I did when I was asked, I think similar question in USQL. If there's some way by which I can absorb information quickly, because I've got so many books, I haven't read through them. So again, like if there's some way I can assimilate all this information, I would go with that actually. Probably like just listening to speeches or like I think that's faster than reading books. I love reading, but then there's only so much I can do. And then I can read faster than like some people have that photographic memory and they can scan through a book like that. Wish I had the ability, but probably just scan a book and then get all the contents absorbed. I would love that.
There you go. Yes. It'd be a very interesting way to learn. Push the capacities of our brain to the edges there, I think.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, AZ, thanks so much for being on the program today. We do appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me here.
So if you've had to do those hierarchies and then had to do recursion to get that information out, I think that graph is going to be a welcome, albeit a different type of change. Yes, we are introducing a new database technology, if you will, although we're still using tables, right? They just have different syntax, if you will, a bit around that. But I think that this is going to allow us to interact with data in different ways. And I think it's cool to see SQL Server change and evolve with that too. And I think that as data professionals, that ability to interact with data and to be able to interact with it easier, I'll say, and provide more value for our users can only be good and help open us up to additional or other opportunities that might come our way. So, compañeros, that's going to do it for today's episode. As always, we're interested in hearing your thoughts, and you can leave that on social media or on the show notes page for today's episode at SQLDataPartners.com/graph. Our music for tips and tricks is by Happy Rock from bensound.com, used under Creative Commons. We hope you'll connect with us on social media. I'm available on LinkedIn. You can reach me at Carlos L. Chacon, and we'll see you on the SQL Trail.
SQL Data Partners.